Welcome, Doug. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to be having a conversation with you and for our friends joining us online. And today, really focusing in on the different healing aspects of yoga, and particularly on the prana body, subtle body, and the way that can really help us in healing both in yoga practice, but also in really healing as a way to really focus in on the different aspects, the inner aspects of the body as we move through asana, as we come into our different practices of meditation and pranayama. And Doug is going to be teaching a workshop on this topic this coming, the weekend of the 14th and 15th. So so we'll get started. Doug, if you would like to just come talk about particularly the sort of definitions of the Vayus and prana and how that relates to the healing aspects of yoga.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm looking forward to coming. It's been a long time since I've taught in California, so I'm really looking forward to that. And we're setting up that weekend to be a nice practical approach to asana practice and some pranayama, working on a level that's accessible to people. Especially making the point that while in asana practice, we tend to focus a lot on the muscles and stretching muscles and strengthening muscles, it really comes down to the movement of the joints because the tone of the muscles is determined by the information coming to the brain from the joints, and then the body adjusts accordingly. And that's kind of an entryway into understanding what the Vayus are about, because I've come to realize that the language that was used in yoga from the Upanishads and also among the Hatha yogis, which is very metaphorical, evocative language. It's not specific, objective language, like a Vayu is not a thing. I can't hold up Pranavayu and show it to you or point to a Panavayu. Rather, they're directing your attention towards an experience that you have inside of yourself as you go through movement in asana or pranayama or so on and so forth. It's really speaking to the function of the nervous system. And when we talk about health and well-being through yoga, which was certainly the interest of the Hatha yogis as they brought active physical practice and much more pranayama techniques into the realm of yoga, they were interested in maintaining the health of the body for the sake of your spiritual practice and also just for the sake of living. And I think they were aware of how much, though they didn't have the language for it, how much the nervous system regulates every aspect of our health. And in modern terms today, we put this in terms of what's called the autonomic nervous system, which is the aspect of the nervous system that takes care of the automatic functions of the body. Things you don't have to think about, like your heartbeat, blood pressure, breathing rate, digestion, all the stuff that goes on automatically, including your immune system. All of that's handled and regulated by the autonomic nervous system. And there are 5 basic functions to the autonomic nervous system. The first is sensation, having to do with the peripheral nervous system, which includes pain management, as well as sensation through the skin, awareness of what's happening through the senses in the skin, but also what's called interoception, our awareness of our inner body states, whether we're feeling good or we feel like we're coming down with a cold or you've got a little indigestion. We actually have more nerves devoted to interoception than we have devoted to the senses themselves. And so we have the potential to be acutely aware of our inner states, which includes emotional states as part of this peripheral nervous system. There's sensation, there are states of interest, curiosity, arousal, which we usually speak of as the sympathetic nervous system. There's also our capacity to go into resting states, like the aspect of the nervous system that governs our sleep cycles, how well we're able to calm down so that we digest our food well and go into restorative states. And then along with that, there is the digestive system itself, which has its own distinct nervous system devoted to the function of digestion, which is keenly attuned to the states of our immune system, because it's through food that most often germs can enter the body. They enter through breath, and in our breathing apparatus, we have ways of filtering the breath to keep germs out. But even more than that, a lot enters into the body through food. So the immune system, that's kind of like our first line of defense, is the digestive system. And then there's cognitive function, mental clarity, clarity of intention, memory, so on and so forth. So 5 basic functions they describe in the autonomic nervous system, which regulate our well-being and are very much interrelated with each other, meant to work together. If you look at the Vayus, these 5 functions of the autonomic nervous system line up quite well with the concept of the Vayus. The first that was mentioned in the Prajna Upanishad is called Vyana Vayu, where Vyana means pervasive or expansive, and it's spoken of in terms of the nadis that permeate the body. And yoga texts say that the nadis originate from the self and the heart, and then expand out through subtler and subtler nadis into the body and even into the space around the body to govern sensation and consciousness. The yogic text said there were 72 million nadis, and we're coming to understand they actually lowballed that. If you think of a nadi as being roughly equivalent to a nerve, we actually have 250 million nerve endings just devoted to interoception within the body, and another 60 million devoted to sensation through the skin. So the count in the Upanishads was actually low, but the point was the same. All aspects of consciousness and sensation are devoted to Vyana Vayu, which lines up quite well with our developing understanding of the peripheral nervous system. And there's even more to it than that, but I'll keep it simple. Pranavayu lines up with the sympathetic nervous system. We usually think of the sympathetic nervous system in terms of a fight or flight response to stress, which is actually kind of unfair, because any state of interest, curiosity, enthusiasm, anything that gets you up in the morning and ready to go, that's sympathetic nervous system. That lines up with the function of pranavayu and how it's described. And then resting states, the parasympathetic nervous system governs our sleep cycles, governs how we calm ourselves down after states of stress, and it's described largely as rest and digest. And that lines up very much with apanavayu, which is both concerned with that rest and digest function and also our ability to eliminate from the body what no longer serves us or what we don't need, whether it's germs killed by the immune system or dead cells that are dead cells are eliminated from the body so they can be replenished with new cells. Apanavayu is much more than simply the exhalation, but it accompanies the kind of calming experience that we have with the exhalation. So you got Vyana, Pranavayu, Apanavayu. Prana and Apana are the most familiar to us, and they work in balance with each other. And then there's what's called Samanavayu, where Sama means equilibrium. And from the very start in the Upanishads, it was connected with the digestive system, how we maintain homeostasis or balance in the body through the process of digestion. We're coming to understand that more and more, again, in terms of its close link with the immune system. And when we talk about wellness in the body, we're often talking about more chronic health problems. Acute health problems come about through injury or disease, and the medical profession does a pretty good job of healing us from those kinds of indignities visited upon the body. What medical science doesn't do so well with are chronic conditions that tend to set in, especially as we go on in life into our later years. And these are inflammatory conditions that tend to last for a long period of time and break down our well-being and break down our immune system. In a profound sense, age itself is an inflammatory condition. Most of the problems that come with age involve some level of inflammation in the body. Samanavayu is all about that. And the Hatha yogis were the first to talk about the health of the digestive system. Nobody in yoga before that spoke about that, but the Hatha yogis understood how crucial the health of the digestive system was to our spiritual life as well as our physical health and well-being. So it very much got incorporated into the practice in connection with the benefits of doing asana for the digestive system, as well as the connection between pranayama or breath practice and the sort of equilibrium that we maintain that includes the digestive system and also expands beyond that into the realm of the immune system and also the deep realm of our emotional body and an understanding of how on a subconscious level, our emotions are in profound ways stored within the gut and affect the functioning of these systems. So Samana Vayu has to do with that whole realm, which is really being discovered on an objective level by science now, but was spoken about on a very intuitive level among the yogis going way back. And then the last one is Udana Vayu, which has to do with intention, how we intentionally engage in our practice for our well-being and how we intentionally engage in actions in the world. And that governs cognitive clarity, memory, strength of intention, and is really the thread that binds all of the other vayus together. So one model for understanding the body is the koshas and the different layers at which we function, from the physical body that we might experience through asana to the prana body, to the level of the mind and the intellect. That's one model of the yoga body for understanding all of the different levels of our well-being that yoga practice touches. The vayus don't get as much treatment as they could or should. It's funny, the vayus were introduced in the Upanishads early on, among the early Upanishads, and set forth along with ideas about the koshas. And then the emphasis in yoga philosophy shifted towards knowledge of the self, towards knowledge of the Atman as dwelling within the heart. And from the line from the Upanishads up through Patanjali, the focus in meditation came to be much more upon stilling the mind and the body in order to know that self within the heart. That goes on for centuries, and then as Hatha Yoga starts to incorporate physical practice and more diverse forms of pranayama, they took up this idea of the vayus once again and reincorporated it into practice. And it's actually very key to understanding the chakras and the role of the chakras in the body as ways of helping to regulate the empowerment that we receive through the vayus. I like to think of the vayus, or the way in which it was presented in the Upanishads, is that the vayus represent the resources we have for maintaining our well-being. When you focus on prana vayu, particularly through pranayama, but also through asana practice, you can increase your enthusiasm for life, increase your motivation, which is actually key to aging gracefully. It's people with an interest and enthusiasm for life. The very process of aging, I've been thinking lately about the term growing old. We think of old as aging as a kind of decline, but when you think of the term growing old, we're actually still in a process of growth as we age throughout that whole time. And it's through the enthusiasm that comes with pranavayu that we actually grow old gracefully in that way. And that's balanced out with maintaining proper resting states of the body. Without good sleep, it's much harder to maintain your health. So practices such as yoga nidra and relaxation are actually training and retraining ourselves to go into these states of rest. So with each of the vayus, from sensation with Vyana Vayu, which is practiced both in asana practice and also in pranayama, I think a lot of the teaching about pranayama has tended to focus much more upon technique, on how you do pranayama in a correct way, when really the essence of pranayama, especially with Hatha Yogis, was the transformational effect of feeling the breath and feeling the different dimensions of the breath that you experience through the different practices. Feeling the breath creates a shift in the nervous system, a shift towards greater enthusiasm with pranavayu, greater resting states and calm with Apanavayu, greater equilibrium in our immune system and digestive system and emotional body through Samanavayu, and also greater clarity of mind through Udanavayu. And so we can kind of identify the role of each of the Vayus in each kind of practice and how we find empowerment through the Vayus. In questions of wellness, people tend to focus on what their problem is, especially when they have a problem diagnosed, like you have this problem, you have that health problem, and people tend to attach to the problem and have a hard time getting out of the problem. They look for some kind of cure, especially from the outside. What we don't generally look to are our resources for dealing with the health problem. And the Vayus point to the different resources for empowerment that we can find within ourselves and access through practice. This is how we deal with whatever health challenge we're faced with. And so when we focus on our powers more than our problems, we're much more empowered to maintain a good state of health. And we know what to look for in our practices to support that kind of thing. So that's kind of an overview, I think, in modern concrete terms of what the Vayus are about. And it gives us a very deep feeling connection to the practices. Often people in a yoga class ask me, in a pose, what am I supposed to feel in this pose? As if it's something determined from the outside. And I often point out to them, the question is not, what are you supposed to feel? The question is, what do you feel? And it's what you feel in the asana that both gives you a sense of the power and the purpose of the asana, but what you feel in the asana or the pranayama or the meditation, any practice you do, becomes the key to how that practice empowers you and supports you and brings greater clarity and greater health. And so when I talk about the Vayus, it's highlighting what is it in the practice that you find empowering, and what are you feeling in the course of doing the practice that becomes empowering. And in connection with what I'm doing in the weekend, next week, when I come to California, is actually starting with the joints as being the center of asana practice. Because on a practical level, the brain pays attention to what's called joint play, which means the freedom of movement of the bones within the joint. Within all of the joints in the body, there's not a lot of space for movement, but there should be about 1/8 of an inch of room of joint play, which means the bones are able to float relative to each other freely. And that's a sign of proper space in the joint. When there is proper joint play, the brain regulates the tone of the muscles so that we're capable of using the joint to its greatest range of motion with stability. If the joints are misaligned, if your arm bone is kind of drifting forward in the shoulder joint, it gets to a position where it doesn't have the same freedom of movement, and the body goes into a protective response, or there's what's called an arthrokinetic reflex, where the reflex of the nervous system is to protect the joint by actually limiting its capacity for movement. So it kind of stabilizes the joint by making some muscles tighter and the muscles trying to move the joint weaker so that you feel stiffer and less mobile, but that's basically to keep you from doing something stupid, like attempting a handstand before your shoulders are ready for it. All of this speaks to Vyanavayu, the sort of pre-conscious perception of the nervous system that looks to the mobility of our joints and regulates the tone of our muscles so that we move within a safe range of motion. So when people come to a yoga class, their first instinct is to stretch a tight muscle or strengthen a weak muscle, and they have some degree of success. But if we don't pay attention to the sensation of movement within the joints too, and I'm talking about simple joint movements or freeing up the joints and experimenting with the range of motion without forcing the joints, when you start to experiment with the free movement of the joints as part of your warm-up, you'll find yourself much more quickly and effectively becoming more flexible and stronger even prior to doing any stretches or strengthening exercises. So based upon that power of sensation in the body that's built into us and built into our very joints. The very tone and strength and flexibility of the body is regulated by that. And that's just an example of the power of Vyana Vayu, of sensation as determining flexibility and strength and so on. And all of the other factors, prana and apana, are really ways of experiencing our movement and the practices, whether it's the movement of the body or the movement of the breath, in a way that further empowers us with greater enthusiasm, deeper resting states, greater equilibrium in the digestive system, and so on. So I'm just offering that as kind of an overview of what the Vayus are really about. They're words that describe or give language to your inner experience that help you to tune into actually what's happening inside of the body as you do your practices. And the chakras are actually tools for focusing in on specific areas in the body to become aware of those inner states, especially in connection with the emotional body, samskaras, and things that have been stored in the body from previous experience. When we have proper access to those memories, we're actually able to negotiate the states of the nervous system so we can better deal with the challenges that life throws at us. That's my little introduction. I'll leave it at that for a moment if you want to jump in with questions or comments or want further clarification on that.
Does anyone have any questions? I wondered if you could, I mean, it's so beautiful. You said so much in 20 minutes. It was extraordinary. I could spend the rest of my life really, looking into and studying that. One of the things that occurred to me that might make it helpful for us, if you could take us through, which I know you're going to do in the workshop, is through each one of the Vayus and give us an example of when you're in a particular yoga pose, how you might connect to that particular Vyana. I don't know if that's something that you could take us through briefly, or if you want to tie it into a breath practice or something like that. So we just kind of know.
Well, to take a few examples of this, and Vyana Vayu has most to do with asana practice. So for instance, part of the workshop is about the shoulders and achieving greater range of motion, flexibility, and stability in the shoulders. As I was saying, it starts with the perception of movement. So rather than simply going into a pose and saying, triangle pose, stretch your arms out like that, often people are limited in the movement of the shoulders. So you see different kinds of misalignments where people are stuck with the shoulder in a certain position and can't seem to get out of it. So to work with some joint freeing series, kind of working with movements of the joint to feel the different realms and ranges in which the joint can move, starts to give a sense of possibility to where you can move the arm to a position where you connect to the shoulder blade and experience a better position or greater sense of freedom in the shoulder itself. And so rather than just say warrior two pose, have your arms like this, triangle pose, have your arms like that, to move the shoulder, feel the movement of the shoulder, and then settle into the position for the shoulder, which feels the most expansive. And that gets into a realm of Vyana Vayu that goes beyond just physical sensation of the joints. It's something that's new in neuroscience, which is to talk about peripersonal space. And it speaks to concepts about, on one level, aura. People have a sense that there's a certain energetic aura to the body. And certainly we do have an electromagnetic field around the body, which is kind of a realm of sensation. But beyond ideas about auras and that kind of thing, they're discovering that the brain creates what are called body maps, which means the brain's perception of the space of the body and the space in which the body can move safely. So for instance, when you use something like a knife or a fork, as far as the brain is concerned, the knife and the fork is an extension of your body. Or if you play tennis, the tennis racket is actually, as far as the brain is concerned, an extension of your body. So if you get really good at it, it's almost like the racket is part of you. These body maps need to be updated when we experience an injury in the body. After healing from the injury, the brain has to update its understanding of how the body can safely move after the injury. And often we get stuck in physical patterns that show a kind of contracted brain map, such that when I see somebody misaligned in a pose, it's not just that the muscles are tight or the joints are stuck. It's kind of an indication of the person's perception of what space they can safely occupy. You know, we talk about people being in an expanded emotional state or a contracted emotional state. When you're feeling very expansive emotionally, then when you walk into a room, everybody feels your energy and you just kind of like, you fill the room with your presence. Movie stars are very good at doing that. Other times, if you're in a very contracted emotional state, your energy is very small, and sometimes people don't even notice you when you walk by because you're so much in yourself. And emotionally, people can be in this contracted body map to the point where they feel they can only occupy this much space safely, and to go beyond that range is actually kind of feels vulnerable to them. And so when they go into an asana, when you see somebody misalign in an asana, it's kind of an indication that the brain doesn't feel that it can safely expand to occupy the space of the asana itself. So the practice of asana is working with templates for the body map that the brain creates and starting to expand your sense of what space you can safely occupy. So to really come into triangle pose, as the body feels that I can really move into this space and experience how I can safely move into that space, it expands your sense of the space that you occupy in general. And your very patterns of movement, even outside of the yoga class, are enhanced by that, and you start to follow healthier patterns of movement. So Vyana Vayu is that sense of not just the inner space of the joints and the muscles, but the very space that you occupy. So that's an example in asana practice. In pranayama practice, there's always the balance between pranavayu and apanavayu. Some pranayama practices give greater energy to your nervous system, so you feel more present, more acutely aware and focused. And other pranayama practices bring a greater sense of calm to the body. And there's actually a measurement for this in modern terms, which is called heart rate variability, which means from heartbeat to heartbeat, sometimes your heartbeat is a little faster by milliseconds, sometimes a little bit slower. And a sign of health in the nervous system is the variability of beat to beat, going faster and slower, because it's showing the adaptability of the nervous system to states of excitation, as well as remaining centered within yourself. And this is connected to greater longevity, greater strength in the immune system, and overall greater health in the digestive system. And when you practice pranayama as well as asana, you're working with both prana and apana to find this delicate balance between being present to the outer world and being centered within yourself, the exhalation, the inhalation. And every pranayama practice strikes this balance between prana and apana that keeps the nervous system at its healthiest and most adaptive. So we'll work with some pranayama practices to find the balance between the two, between exhalation and inhalation. And the third element of pranayama practice is the moment of pause between the breaths. When you breathe out, there's a pause before the breath comes in. When you breathe in, there's a pause before the breath goes out. In the Vijnana Bhairava, many of the techniques in the Vijnana Bhairava center around the Hamsa practice, the practice of the Hamsa mantra, the breath coming in with hum and going out with so or sa. And you're told to focus on that pause at the end of sa before the breath comes in with hum, and focus on the hum, the pause in the heart before the breath goes out with sa. That's a practice of equilibrium, of samanavayu. And the Vijnana Bhairava says that's the moment in which you experience fullness in that equilibrium. So along with prana and apana, there's that experience of kumbhak or pause, which is a moment of samanavayu. Was somebody trying to, I'll get back to the joint, two questions here from Alexis. I'm saying the joints talk to the brain or the brain speaks to the joints. Both. It's a feedback mechanism where the nerves in the joints report back to the brainstem about the state of the joints, how freely the joints are moving, especially when they're at rest. And then based upon that information, the brain sets up a sort of body map or predictive model for what movement is safe. So for instance, if you spend the whole week sitting at work at the typewriter and you never lift your arm over your head for anything, you're always sitting and typing and driving, the amount of information that the brain has from the shoulders is just this kind of range of motion. Imagine if at the end of the week, you go into a yoga class and the teacher says, let's do downward facing dog pose, or let's do a handstand. The brain says, wait a second, I don't have enough information to go on to know if it's even safe to attempt that. I'm going to protect the body by making the shoulders stiff so this guy doesn't try to do a handstand. So when a person says, I'm too weak, I'm too stiff to do a handstand, that's actually true because the brain is saying, I don't have enough information to go on to decide whether it's safe to attempt that pose, so I'm not going to allow you to do it. Once you start to move the shoulder and start to send more information to the brain about the free movement of the joint and its coordination with the shoulder joint, the brain says, okay, now I've got more information to go on, so I can start to let those tight muscles loosen up a little bit. The muscles that I've weakened, I can make them a little bit stronger. So now it becomes more possible to stretch the arms overhead in a downward facing dog pose, or even attempt something like a variation on a handstand. So based on the information going from the body to the brain in turn regulates the tones of the muscles surrounding the joints, which determine what the muscles can do. And the more you do, the more information you have to go on. And the more information the brain has to go on, the more the brain can allow the body to do more things. And that's the sense in which an asana is a template for giving the brain more information so that the brain has a more expanded sense of the space in which you can occupy and in which you can move safely. So it's a brain to body communication. And in Hatha Yoga, when they talk about cleansing the nadis, different practices of cleansing the nadis, they can be physical practices, in some cases having to do with the digestive system, in some cases having to do with asana, in some cases like Nadi Shodhana, having to do with the breath. When they're talking about cleansing practices, they're really talking about opening these pathways of communication between body and mind such that the body can function in a more healthy way and the mind can participate in empowering and supporting that healthy function. And so there's a term in connection with the chakras called granthis, where the term granthi means a knot, literally like a string tied up in a knot. And they regard that as a block in the sense of a block in communication between body and mind. And so they literally speak of the pranayamas, for instance, Kapalabhati and Bhastrika, as cutting these knots or granthis, which means reestablishing communication between body and mind so that you can go into deeper meditative states and overcome the kinds of obstacles that we experience inside, some of which are physical, some of which are even emotional or mental. So it's all about those pathways of communication. And when it comes to how chakras are tools, we can make a distinction between nadis, which they treat as something very real, corresponding to nerves. And so when you do asana practices, you're stretching the flesh in which the nerves exist. And by that, you start to undo blocks in the nadis, especially releasing blocks in the connective tissue that affects the flow of information through the nerves. And they're also talking about the nadis in terms of what I was describing as the body maps that the brain constructs to understand how to move safely in space. But overall, they speak of nadis quite literally as things that you can directly influence physically, whether through asana practice or pranayama, or even doing emotional work psychologically. The chakras are tools. And we can say that because many different texts have many different numbers of chakras. The first Hatha Yoga text had 5 chakras. The one that the Hatha Yoga tradition settled upon was called the Kubjika Mata Tantra, which contained the 6 chakras that we're familiar with. And it's funny because in that text, there's both a 5 chakra system and a 6 chakra system, and they have no problem with the contradiction between the two. Later on, the Sat Chakra Nirupama added in the Sahasrar as a 7th chakra. There are other texts that have 8, 11, 20, as many as 32 chakras, which suggests that they're not treating the chakras as objective things in the body like a heart or a liver or a kidney. A chakra is a tool for focusing the imagination. And it's through the practice of bhavana, of projecting into the body how you imagine the chakras. The exercise of the creative imagination becomes the means by which we gain information from the body about our inner states. And so a chakra is a tool for focusing. And if a certain chakra system works for you effectively as a tool for focusing within, then in a pragmatic sense, that chakra system works for you. You could have a more elaborate system of 20 chakras, depending upon what you're seeking. You could have a simpler system of 5 or 6. Whatever works for you relative to your purpose is basically the chakra system that is real for you. And there's no text that says one system of chakras is the authentic system and the others are not authentic or not complete. There's no text that says that. The chakras really describe what they call the map of the yoga body, how we conceive of the yogi's body relative to our purposes. Some yogis sought supernatural powers, and so the map of the chakras and the other, what they call adharas, or places of pilgrimage within, are different power points in the body by which that yogi believed he or she could access supernatural powers. If you're looking for releasing samskaras in the emotional body, then there's a certain map of both the chakras and the obstacles or granthis that you face that give you a map for the journey for working through these different emotional blocks. And this is not just unique to the Hatha Yoga system. You have Teresa of Avila in the 15th century wrote kind of her spiritual biography of her spiritual journey, where she described going through 7 mansions or castles within, each of which was a step in her spiritual evolution. And her description of those 7 mansions kind of parallels the description of the 7 chakras that you find in some Hatha Yoga texts or Yoga Tantric texts. So the map of the chakras is relative to the journey that you want to make, and the map can change according to your purposes. So again, this is to say, chakras are real to the extent that they work for you, to the extent that they're effective, but it's not saying that they're objective things that exist within the body, because any doctor that does an operation or an autopsy will tell you when you open up the human body, there's not a flower inside of the heart, there's not a flower in the digestive system. So it's not real in that sense, but it's a tool for practice in conjunction with the nadis. That was a long answer to that question. I hope it's helpful. But for instance, in the area of samana vayu, this is the level of digestion and of the gut. So going beyond talking about digestion, the gut, we're coming to understand, is the place where the majority of hormones are produced in the body, and hormones regulate our emotional states or give rise to or accompany different emotional states. So when you're in an excited emotional state, you produce adrenaline, and then you feel that emotion as excitement. And the body remembers that reflex when you're in a certain situation that gets you excited or perhaps fearful or stressed, and you start to produce adrenaline in response to it. The gut remembers that reflex. so that when you're in the same situation in the future, that cue sets off the same reflex of production of adrenaline. So that becomes the samskara on a kind of hormonal level that happens very much in the gut. And there's a learning process in the gut. When we tell people, listen to your gut, or when we describe emotions in terms of gut feelings or even flavors or taste, like an emotion has a bitter flavor or a sweet flavor, we're really speaking to that deep sort of subconscious level, which is our emotional body that we access through the lower chakras, the navel to the Swadhisthana, all the way down to the Muladhara. It's kind of going below the conscious mind and using the chakra as a tool for focusing in on that area of the body and eliciting or remembering those samskaras or reflexes that tend to shape our responses to our present condition or situation. And so the chakra in that sense is a tool for focusing, and the chakra speaks to the sort of vayu that is operative in that area of the body through the practice. So pranayama practice speaks to prana, apana, samana, that state of equilibrium, which includes emotional balance, and then finally speaks to udana, where you intentionally direct the breath, such as up through the sushumna, in order to achieve higher states of meditation. The breath goes on automatically, normally. When you engage in pranayama, you start to breathe intentionally or purposefully. And when you start to breathe intentionally and direct the breath along certain pathways, now you're being empowered by udana vayu, your power of intention, by which you can make the breath practice powerful for yourself. And that yields mental clarity and mental sharpness. So the practices really accompany the vayus, and the different chakras and how we locate them in the body help us to further focus in on what we're experiencing internally in that particular area of the body, because there is a reality to that, and it's effective in doing that. Again, long answer to a short question. I hope that gave some examples of how it works. And in the workshop, we're going to go practically from asana practice and just getting a taste of how the vayus work in a practical way for movement from the shoulders to the sacrum to the neck and so on. And then we'll move into pranayama as a way of going deeper into the experience that is opened up through the asana practice.
Wonderful. Yeah, anybody have any questions following that? I mean, it is just astounding the level of intricacies that these, ancient wisdom healers had such a good grasp on all the different aspects, and the way in which, we Westerners, we're so unconscious that we people don't even know where to find their feet.
Yeah,
And,
I think what's really appealing to me in the system is your practice starts with sensation, with Vyanavayu, with feeling. That's where they start in the Upanishads. It's feeling the body, feeling the breath. And honestly, that's very often what we don't do, because we can get so stuck in our head and our thoughts and our work that we're actually not fully feeling the body. And that's where our health starts to deteriorate, because there's that lack of connection to the body. So the starting point of practice is feeling. Then they take you through the feeling of excitation and calm, prana, apana. They take you through the feeling of equilibrium until you get to the point of empowerment of your intention. Once you've felt the body, you can live in the body and live in the breath more intentionally. And it's the clarity of intention, udana vayu, by which we live, that we support the whole circle of the vayus. The better we live intentionally, the better the body can maintain its health and support our intention. The better we live intentionally, the more fully we feel. The more fully we feel, the better we can live intentionally. And all of the vayus just come in between. So it's really a mutually supportive circle between all of these that describes the wholeness of our health, both mentally, emotionally, and physically in the body.
I was thinking of the word awakening too, of so much of it really is just awareness and awakening through all the different systems in the body. And it would be such a great thing if children were taught this at a young age, of really being able to tune into all the different systems, and that, there's so much that's unconscious that affects, the way we're eating, the way we're breathing, that we don't even notice, and that we'll go through the rest of our lives not even really being aware of the habits and patterns. So thank God for yoga. That's all I can say. Thank you, Olga. Thank goodness for you, Doug, too. Just, it's so wonderful the way you tied it all out and really tied everything in together in such an expansive way. Really appreciate that.
And what you're saying, I was kind of thinking about how, when we're kids, we play games, play sports, and get into dance and other things. And it's always outward directed activity, which is fun and it's great for kids and it's healthy. But in the process, we're often taught not to listen to the body. When you're in competitive sports, you're taught not to listen to the body. You focus on what you're trying to achieve or what you're trying to do. The same thing in dance and other activities. And I think why yoga is being discovered as an important element to introduce to kids in school is that they're finally getting the chance to just take time and feel. To feel the body and be in the body without it being driven by some extrinsic or external purpose. And that becomes the foundation of their own calmness and their own well-being and their capacity for self-soothing, which is something that's actually a learned capacity. And so that element of yoga as not being, or it's not meant to be competitive or seek any kind of external goal. It's rather turning yourself towards that, like you're saying, awakening, which just means being awake to your own inner experience. And that's the key to the spiritual path. And even just plain and simple, the key to your own well-being, your own health, is that it starts with that self-awareness.
Absolutely. I see a couple of questions in the...
Yeah, go ahead. I'm looking at the questions in the... I know with the inferior, what we call the lower chakras, and I'll get to the raised hand in a second, speak to the different levels of consciousness in the body, and you can relate it to the vagus nerve as being central to the cranial nerves. And of course, with the Hatha yogis, they were the first to talk about the Ida and the Pingala connected to the nostrils. And that very much lines up with the branches of the vagus nerve that go deeply into the body. And it's called the vagus because it means vagrant or wanderer. And so it's got something like 65 million nerve endings that insinuate themselves into every level of the body. So a lot of the branches of the vagus nerve are centered around voice, breath, expression. Their branches are in the nostrils and the voice box, and also the nerves that control facial expression and social interaction. So at that level, the vagus nerve operates on a very conscious level in terms of how we modulate, how we express ourselves to others, and also perceive how others express themselves to us, such that other people become part of our sense of self or part of that body map. So you'd think of those as the higher chakras. In the level between the collarbones and the diaphragm, the vagus nerve is very much involved in the heart and the diaphragm and those functions. And this is where pranavayu is very active. So when you get excited about something, the vagus nerve gets the heart to speed up and it changes your breathing to support that state of excitation. So this is on a level of conscious response to your environment. And so a lot of the messages go through the vagus nerve from the brain to the heart and the diaphragm and the lungs, telling it how to behave. And misalignments, as the one question from Alexis is pointing out, has an effect upon that communication. Below the level of the diaphragm, the vagus nerve goes into the digestive system, systems of elimination, hormonal system, and there most of the communication goes from the gut to the brain. 80% of the communication goes from the gut to the brain. Only 20% goes from the brain telling the gut what to do. And again, this is the level of intuition where you build up a lot of experience from, a lot of learning from previous experience as your gut feelings, as your intuition. And this is really, in a physical sense, where samskaras are stored. And so when you come into a situation that's a cue from a previous experience, often we have an emotion coming up and we don't know why. And a samskara is a memory with an emotion attached, which colors or influences our present state of the nervous system or emotional state. That's sort of on a pre-conscious level. And the less we're aware of these samskaras coming up, the less we understand why we go through the different moods that we do. So the lower chakras are kind of tuning, you could call them the lower chakras, but it's kind of the level at which the body's trying to speak to you, and we're often not listening, especially the body's trying to speak to us on an emotional level based upon our previous experience and the life that we've lived to this point. And if we're not listening to it, we don't understand our emotional states. So the lower chakras, from the navel to Swadhisthana to Muladhara, is our way of tuning into what the body is telling us. And there are very clear pathways through the vagus nerve by which you're doing it. So when you focus on nostril breathing and the experience of the breath going from the nostril all the way down to the pelvic floor, that's reestablishing that pathway of communication. So it is related to the unconscious. I like to call it the preconscious, because the preconscious mind is the place of intuition where we start to get cues. It's like when you walk into a room and you feel something's not quite right here, or you feel unsafe. You're already picking up on cues before the brain even understands it, telling you something is wrong, and it starts to make you look around to try to figure out what's going on. So this is the sort of preconscious mind located in the gut, which is even faster than your conscious mind. And the better we learn to listen to that preconscious mind, the better we can respond appropriately to our situation. And by appropriately, I mean also overcome some of the traumatic responses that sometimes get built into our system based upon previous trauma. We can react more appropriately to the situation by setting up that network of communication in that way. And yeah, I know Andrea had her hand up too. She wanted to pop in with a question. I don't know, in the chat box or...
Andrea, what I wanted to ask is, what you have offered and said has been so, there's so much, it's so rich and full, and I wish I were at the spectrum where I had practiced in that way or learned and understood in that way to pay attention to the sensations. I'm very sensitive, and I tend to pick up things, but it's like where to go with that, you know? And I don't know if this is a simple question, just trying to think of a simple way to approach, like say doing an asana when something comes up, what do I do with that? Or just...
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different levels at which things come up, like at a simple level of physical asana, to work with an asana and either feel stuck in the asana or tight, or experience discomfort or perhaps pain. It's a chance to explore on a very physical level how to work with what's coming up, because what's coming up is a valid message from the body. And how can you adjust in the asana so that feels like a safe place to be, as opposed to something that feels not quite right or a little unsafe or a little bit painful. So that's an exercise in Vyana Vayu. And of course, you know, when we tell students to listen to their body, they usually interpret it as to mean, if you're feeling pain, stop doing it, which of course is valid. If something hurts, stop doing it. Figure out why you're experiencing pain. But it's also an exploration of what feels right in the asana. It's like, how do you feel in a good way in the asana? That's also a learning, because you carry with that experience of being in the asana and feeling safe and expansive and present, that's Vyana Vayu, and that's a learning experience too, and it's part of the practice. Or in pranayama, what's the state of calm that you're brought to? When you get into deeper practices, I mean, asana is on a very tangible level, so it's easy to work with initially with people, and they start to join the breath to the movement and then start to have a more expanded experience of safe, comfortable, pain-free movement in the body that grows and becomes more expansive the more you practice it. You get into pranayama, and then with that forms of meditation, then you get other kinds of sensations coming up inside, which can be emotional responses or can simply be a sense of resistance. Like if you tell a student, focus on your heart with the breath, or focus on the space of the navel, and the student's thinking, I can't quite go there. I can't relate to that part of my body. I can't quite hold my attention in that space. The yogis were speaking of that as a grunti, as a knot, where they say it's a place that consciousness turns away from, like I can't quite go there. It may be related to trauma. It may not be related to trauma, but the tools of the breath, the idea of breathing into that particular part of the body, we'll talk about how to do that, is a way of starting to be comfortable with placing your attention there. And what's joined to it, which is a little bit more of an answer to your question, is the whole element of vibration or mantra, where mantra becomes a tool associated with the chakras on a very simple level. It's the very power of the vibration of the mantra that starts to work through those knots or work through those sensations. And in untying the knot, they say it releases a certain level of bliss. People talk about opening the chakras, and opening the chakra is unveiling a certain level of bliss contained within the nervous system, which is revealed when you're able to hold your mind there. And join to it perhaps vibration or mantra as a focusing technique, or simply the breath. So yeah, you've got a very broad question about what to do with it. And the answer is there are many levels of tools for working with each level of experience, from physical sensation to emotional experience to even the kinds of memories and associations that come up with the practice. And each level of practice is meant to reveal the wisdom contained within that experience or within that sensation. You feel something for a reason because there's a wisdom contained within that sensation. And it's kind of like peeling back that sensation. Just for example, the chakra of the heart is described as having a lot of petals, 12 petals, and each petal has its own vibration to it, its own bija mantra. There's one central bija mantra for the heart, and then there are these sub-vibrations. You don't have to know the vibrations of each petal to understand it. Rather, it's a way of saying how each petal corresponds to a very pure feeling in the heart, which we can come to feel in a contracted way. Like when the prana moves one petal of the heart, you have an experience of love. But based upon experiences that you've had in your life, some scars that's built up around relationships, that very pure feeling of the heart of love can be experienced as perhaps infatuation or jealousy, all of which is just a contracted form of love. And the point of going into the heart and joining the breath and mantra and vibration to kind of resonate with that petal is to release that contraction around the pure feeling so that the essence of the pure love shows itself once the contraction is taken away. Worry is a contracted form of contentment, for instance. And so to explore the heart, we feel different contracted feelings come up in the heart, but we're looking to dissolve the contraction to find the purity behind it. So the question, what do I do with it? Well, at different levels, you have different tools for working with it, internally in meditation or externally through asana. And so, yeah, you have to kind of take it step by step.
Very helpful.
Thank you. Yeah.
Very clear and specific. I mean, I feel like, okay, I have these different tools I know about, I can do.
Yeah, they're already familiar, as just how we understand the tools can be really helpful.
Good, thank you.
Well, it also really emphasizes the reason for meditation too, so that you actually have the spaciousness to be able to notice. Because actually, sometimes when we're moving through asana, there's not enough spaciousness to actually even have
Yeah.
to feel it. So you can see why, meditation is such an important part of practice. Yeah. And also it made me think of the image of, it's like listening into the different members of the team. How's the gut?
Yeah.
How's my, like going around making sure, is the team doing well? How is the team doing? And is something shut down, and how does that relate to everything else that's happening? And so there's sort of internal monitoring that's done consciously.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, so much of modern health problems have to do with inflammatory conditions in our immune system and in the gut in particular. And usually when you catch a cold or have an injury, inflammation is the body's way of killing the germs and accelerating the healing process. So when you've healed from the injury or from the cold, the disease, the inflammation goes down because it's not necessary anymore. And so you have inflammation, and then the inflammation goes away. Sympathetic nervous system causes inflammation. Parasympathetic says, you're fine now, there's no need for inflammation. Inflammatory conditions, especially with age, are basically when that line of communication is shut down and the inflammation continues as kind of like a vicious cycle because it never quite gets the message to stop. And so that's when it becomes chronic, and with it a chronic pain condition. So the communication between the mind and those, like you're saying, those team members in the body has broken down. So the team members are stuck in this sort of loop of inflammation because nothing acts to get them out of it. And then it becomes chronic. And once you reestablish communication, the message from the parasympathetic nervous system, and that's the main concern of the vagus nerve and the cranial nerves, and most yoga techniques are concerned with stimulating the cranial nerves of the parasympathetic nervous system. Once they reassert their dominance, then it shuts down the unnecessary inflammatory conditions in the body, and the body maintains its health. So on a very practical level, checking in with all the team members in the body is key to maintaining health in the body and avoiding chronic conditions.
Wonderful. I can see we're at the hour. There's one more question.
Sure.
Joy.
Go ahead.
Hi. I think in one of your videos you had mentioned something about in the gut having its own set of nerves that were communicators from the outside world to the inside world. Is that kind of what you're talking about as far as aging and not that communication, not connecting?
Yeah, they call it the enteric nervous system. You got sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric refers to an entirely distinct bundle of nerves in the gut that regulate digestion. And in experiments, they found that they could sever nerves going from the brain to the digestive system, and the digestive system will continue to function on its own steam. So it kind of runs itself, and not only regulating digestion, but also immune responses as well as the production of hormones. And it builds up its reflexes. And so the outer world comes into the gut through the food that we eat and so on. And we form different reflexes in how we respond to what's coming into the body. And so that functions independently, and our emotional reflexes are built up there. Usually the gut is supposed to be telling the brain what's going on so that the brain can respond appropriately. If your stomach is upset, the gut is saying, I'm upset, maybe you're not eating the right kind of food. And so the brain adjusts and says, okay, maybe I'll stop eating this. I'll, cut back on my diet for a while and see if that helps. So it's getting helpful messages from the gut about how to adjust. And
at age, does that deteriorate?
I think with age, for different reasons, which can be postural or otherwise, there's less of a connection to the activity of the gut, especially if the body starts to collapse in upon itself and the fascia starts to tighten up, largely from lack of movement. As long as you maintain movement in the body, the fascia remains healthy and the pathways of communication are maintained. But as movement is reduced, communication is reduced. Also, a thing that happens with age is what I mentioned about heart rate variability. The graph kind of goes like this with age, where you go to less and less heart rate variability as part and parcel of the aging process, though it doesn't have to be such a steep curve. The better you maintain contact with the nervous system through prana and apana, through stimulation and rest, the heart rate variability does not have to go down so much. When heart rate variability decreases, that means there's less responsiveness between the brain and the nervous system and a greater likelihood for inflammatory states. And so as you maintain better heart rate variability, which we do through movement, regularity in our diet, regularity in our rest, variety in our actions, enthusiasm in what we do, interest, curiosity, all of that maintains heart rate variability, and all of that helps the nervous system to reduce the inflammatory states that otherwise tend to accompany the aging process. So it doesn't have to be that way. But if we do less, then we kind of follow that progression in heart rate variability, and the communication breaks down. But it doesn't have to be that way. Once again.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Doug, this coming workshop, the 14th and 15th, we'll also have available for folks if they want to join us online as well. And you can always watch them later if you can't make those particular dates, but hopefully you'll be able to make it to the workshop.
Yeah.
Is there anything else to say about the workshop?
Yeah, for the recordings, I'm going to be recording it separately on the camera, and so when I edit it, it'll actually be a lot better quality than what you generally get on Zoom. So when you go back to view it again, it'll be a nice high quality recording with good sound and good picture and several camera angles, so you can see what's going on. So I hope you can join us for the weekend. We are going to be going step by step, starting with the most practical aspect of practice, which is movement and asana, dealing with the issues that people are most often concerned with in the body, like lower back health, surrounding issues of movement in the sacrum. I'll give an overview on the idea of how the joints of the body move in general and how we can put that to use in asana practice to achieve greater flexibility and greater strength and stability. First example is going to be the hips. First session will be the hips. Second, we'll go into the low back and the sacrum. The third session, the second day, is going to go into the shoulders. And then the fourth session is going to connect the shoulders to the neck and the upper body. And along with those 4 sessions, working on a very practical level with asana, we'll also incorporate breath practice and a sense of how we can feel and experience the Vayus in a very tangible way in these practices, from asana to pranayama to even centering and relaxation at the end with some degree of meditation and yoga nidra. So it'll be a nice, accessible, full experience of the whole range of what's involved in a yoga practice. I certainly hope you can make it to that.
Yes, I'll send the link to everybody so that you can have a look at the timing and everything else like that.
And also, even if you're there for the live experience, you'll also have access to the recordings. So you can go back and watch them again, because often you're taking in so much when you're in the room doing the practice that you wish you could go back and see what happened, so you can kind of relive the experience through the recordings, which is always nice.
Be with Doug. There's so much